It is game week once again here in college football. In the South, it's semifinal week for the college football playoffs. We've also got other bowl games going on that we're going to talk about, including the one that Auburn is playing in. Joining me to break down everything that's going on in this final week of 2020 and what a year it has been are two of the best reporters in the Southeastern Conference. That would be Matt Zenitz on my right and John Talty at the bottom of your screen. Joining me for this week's First Down South, which is brought to you by Andrews Sports Medicine this week, who's sponsoring our coverage of the college football playoff semifinals. So, guys, one more week to go. What'd you say, Matt?
Hey, I need to shave. Stacy's going to be pissed at me when she watches this. Not a good facial hair. I need to have the clean face look like Talty.
It's the end of 2020. We're all going to be expected to look a little bit worse for the wear this week. I think we just got to make it through this week, and I feel like things are gonna be looking up here. But we'll talk about
the thing. I have to throw out kudos to Talty. Talty, hey, as first off changes up the scenery, but hey, as the look hey, as the high end New York, New Jersey condo look behind him. I like it. So a nice change up.
Just trying to give the viewers a little taste, a little different taste each week.
Taste of the Talty high life, if you will.
The biggest thing you left out, though, not only is it playoff semifinal week, a lot of bowl games. It's Matt Scalisi's Wonder Woman 84 week. I think the audience wants to know before we get into football stuff, just with the Matt Scalisi review.
Lots of new movies suddenly getting dumped on us at the end of the year. So I'm just glad to have new movies. Wonder Woman, the new Wonder Woman's not perfect, but it was a new movie, and there's big explosions in it and people getting flicked around by a glowing whip. I would rather have that than not have it. Okay. That's my position on it. So,
it's the first movie that you've seen where Kristen Wiig was responsible for some of the throwing people around. Was it nice to see her transition into a different sort of character? Were you excited?
I love that I'm now being interviewed about my movie opinions in the middle of this show. But yeah, I mean, Kristen Wiig was fun. Pedro Pascal is really fun in it too.
I agree.
Let's roll this into another weird situation that we all lived through the past few weeks. That would be the Auburn coaching search. And since we last did our show, Auburn has now hired a coach. They hired Brian Harsin from Boise State. We left you last week just hours before that hire was made. So we haven't had a chance to really talk about the hire yet, but I'll refer you back to a story that John Talty published on AL.com a few days ago, sort of really going into and detailing the behind the scenes narrative that was going on in this coaching search. And it was very interesting and dramatic, and not necessarily like every coaching search that we hear about in college football. And John, I won't ask you to recap the whole story, but I am curious kind of what your takeaway has been overall about Auburn, about how things worked internally, and what it sort of tells us about Auburn from this coaching search.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you notice is just that, I feel like this is sometimes always going to be a factor with Auburn, that you just have a sect of very involved boosters and high money donors who expect to be a big part of any sort of decision. One of the interesting things that, I'm, I guess fairly new to the state, I think I'm closing in on my 7th year here, is just how reminiscent this situation was to the one that Terry Bowden went through in the late 90s, in which, it was kind of a bit of a coup to push him out and try to slide in Brother Oliver, the longtime Alabama assistant. And it just feels very similar to what we saw almost happen here, in which Gus Malzahn gets fired, and some of these powerful people want to slide in Kevin Steele to be the next head coach. The interesting thing, I think, ultimately with this search in particular, was just kind of this bit of a power tug between these powerful boosters and also the administration, which includes athletic director Alan Green. Alan Green ultimately wins out here and gets a guy that he wanted, had a little bit of a tie to in the past, and really worked with President Jay Gouge to make sure that this was a true national search, and that they considered all possible candidates beyond just Kevin Steele, who's obviously just right there in the building.
Yeah, and it's interesting that is notable, right? And I think people who maybe have not followed Auburn coaching searches in the past and don't know as much about kind of the history there would say, hey, that's what it's supposed to be like, right? That's what it sounds like you're supposed to do. That's what we hear from every other coaching search is we made it a national search. We look for the best possible candidate. It's not always how things work traditionally at Auburn. And I think the fact that it maybe did work that way this time could set up kind of some interesting dynamics for the future. Before we get into that, Matt Zenitz, I think one of the pressing questions right now going forward, now that they have Brian Harsin, is who's his staff going to be? What is the makeup of the full coaching staff at Auburn? We don't really know a lot yet. We haven't heard much on that front. What can you tell us about that side of things right now?
Yeah, the expectation from people I've talked to is that they're not going to notify the current staff of what the plan is until after Auburn gets through the bowl game. The expectation, as I'm sure you can imagine, is that they're going to go a different direction with the majority of the staff. There's a possibility for some of the current coaches, and just in conversations with John, Cadillac Williams is one that we've talked about that could potentially make sense there in terms of being retained, even though we haven't heard anything official in terms of that. But the full expectation is that probably will be, for the most part, a completely new staff, although once again, the current members of that staff will not know officially until after the bowl game. One person specifically that's probably worth mentioning, Kevin Steele. Kevin Steele, the people I've talked to do not expect him to be a part of this staff moving forward, which probably shouldn't be a big surprise, just considering the fact that he lost out to Brian Harsin in essentially this competition for the head coaching job, and just based on how this process played out with him. But at the same time, I think he's going to have some interest and opportunities where he could potentially be back, not only working next season, but potentially even in the SEC, based on some things I've heard in terms of some of the schools that are interested in him.
Very interesting. And has been, look, however people felt about him as a head coaching candidate, has certainly been a respected defensive coordinator at Auburn, and I'm sure would be an attractive candidate to a lot of schools who need a defensive coordinator right now.
Yeah. And two, just to give specific schools, two that people in the coaching world have mentioned just to keep an eye on as possibilities for him, LSU being one, South Carolina being another one.
Matt,
the two popular ones that people have thrown out.
Yeah, and he's obviously got connections to the staffs in both places. Matt, I know a lot has been said so far about Brian Harsin and his lack of familiarity with the South in general, and how that could potentially be a detriment when it comes to recruiting. Do you expect him to mostly bring in staff that he's worked with before, or do you think that he will probably go after some people that have some SEC experience?
Hard to say 100% at this point, but I would be very much surprised if once this staff is finalized, if there are not a good amount of people, at least some members of this staff, with SEC ties and ties from a recruiting standpoint down south. That's going to be something very important for him, and I would be very surprised if the staff, whenever it's finalized, doesn't include some coaches that fall in those categories.
I think it has to be a mix. I think that's what you're going to see. I mean, it would be surprising for him not to bring some people with him from Boise State. Obviously, he had success there. There's, I think, especially from an offensive side of things, it would make sense to bring some of those guys along. But, like Zenitz was just hitting on, recruiting down south is different. We saw Joe Moorhead had some struggles when he came down. You got to have connections. You got to have people that can kind of help you get in the door of high school coaches, and you need some people with Southern ties. And so, Matt mentioned Cadillac Williams. I think he'd make a lot of sense just based on his ties and kind of brand name around the state. And you're going to need at least 2 or 3 of those guys who can help you just from a recruiting standpoint that have been around the SEC.
And we know that Auburn has always also had I would say, a unique situation where having former players on the coaching staff has always been a valuable thing there, if only because you're having to deal with a lot of internal stuff, and to kind of transition that into where we go from here, John. I think what you described in your writing and reporting about this story shows that even though Auburn and everybody at Auburn may be happy with how the coaching search ultimately turned out, it did reveal some rifts. It revealed some disagreements about how things should work internally at Auburn. And that could create some challenges going forward. Where do you see that, I think, being a potential pressure point at Auburn?
Yeah, I mean, here's the important thing to remember is that, you need some of these important people who wanted Kevin Steele to be the next head coach. You need their money. These are people that give a lot of money and have been supportive over the years. And so, you can say, all right, we don't need those people anymore. But the next time you're trying to raise money, for facilities upgrades, you're going to have to go to those people for money. And you basically just told them, that's great, you want Kevin Steele, but we don't care because we're doing something else. And so there's potential for there to be ramifications from that. I think one of the things that would be very beneficial for everyone involved, and this is an obvious point, but just given what we know about some of the disagreement, is for Brian Harsin to come out and be successful in year one. I think the schedule sets up in a way that that's definitely possible. And I think would help probably calm some of the concerns and maybe hurt feelings from the people who wanted Kevin Steele. But if he comes out and struggles in year one, you're going to see the same kind of people who are kind of maybe doing some things behind the scenes on Gus, maybe start to do that again with Harsin. And certainly with Allen Green, who really stuck his neck out for this hire. And when you do that, there could be some blowback, especially if it doesn't work.
And we know go ahead, Matt.
I just have to throw in. I'm surprised that Talty didn't find a way to work in the great hot tub pool conversation that Brian Harsin and Allen Green apparently had. Wait, what was it? 5 years ago when they first connected?
Yeah, I think they referred to it as a pool. I just kind of assume it's a hot tub, but that was an interesting story. And not to go on too long of a diatribe here, but it is always funny when schools make hires. They always try to find a way to show that it was more than just like a one-day romance. There always has to be some sort of connection in the past. And it was amusing to me and also a little weird that they felt the need to tell that specific story to show that Allen and Brian knew each other from beyond just the past week.
Yeah, I mean, look, mythologizing is a big part of all of it. It's you have to get buy-in, and that's a really important thing early on for a coach when he doesn't have a record to lean on to prove himself to the new fans. It has to feel special anyway. People have to feel like there's a reason he's the guy. And I think you're right about the need for early success. As much as we like to talk about, this guy needs to have 3-4 years, needs to get his own guys in there. You really have to get buy-in really quickly. It's something that Gus was fortunate enough to have. It's something that Chizik got relatively quickly at Auburn as well. I think especially with the need for facilities at Auburn to keep up recruiting wise, I think that could really be an issue 3-4 years from now, with potentially a rough recruiting class coming in this cycle for Auburn. They need to find a way to make up the gap with the Alabamas and the LSUs and the Georgias and Floridas that they're recruiting against every year. And right now they're a little behind the 8 ball on that.
Well, and just not to go in too long, I think, but just think about this. Next season you have Alabama and Georgia at home. Your cross-rival game is, I believe, South Carolina. You do have Penn State, but everybody else is very winnable. I mean, that's a season that is set up very, very well for that first year. And I think, I'm sure Scalise, you probably heard some of the same things, but one of the things that I've heard, part of why I think they made a move on Gus this year was that they were afraid he was going to have a really good year next year, and then he was going to have to get an extension. They were going to kind of keep doing this thing they've been doing. So it's set up very well for Harsin to have success. And I think, it's tough to put too much pressure on a first-year coach, but anything less than 8 wins, I think, is definitely a disappointment next year.
I will say very confidently that there will be at least one thing very different compared to Gus's tenure: press conferences. So fans and media people can definitely expect something different in terms of those press conference type settings, as evidenced by that first Brian Harsin press conference. So, hey, had heard going into that and just coming out of him getting hired, that this is a guy who's very open, candid when it comes to press conferences, dealing with the media and all of that. And I think it's safe to say that it probably would never see Gus having an hour and 10-minute.
Yeah, it was. I'll say this for Gus, because we had some great experiences with him in isolated settings. But yes, Gus calling Gus candid would not be a good description for his press conferences, I think. And look, that's how he chose to run things. He felt like it was better to say less most of the time. And, I think that's never something that media people particularly love. But I think that's how he chose to run things. And people didn't really, in some ways, I think it may have hurt Gus in the long run because he didn't give a lot of people opportunities to develop sort of affection for him by showing more of his personality. I mean, it's funny that one of the last things we saw of him as the Auburn head coach was this like very fun moment of him dancing in the locker room with his players being goofy. And I think if we'd seen more of it, yeah, very Ted Lasso like. That's right, John. If we'd seen more of that along the way for Gus, I think maybe the overall sentiment about him might have been a little different.
I think people who know Gus would tell you he is a good man.
Yeah.
Clearly his players loved him. He recruited well. But to your point, we never really saw a lot of that. And I think ultimately one of the things that really doomed Gus from a big picture standpoint is he was just very paranoid. He didn't really let people in. And it's not just media people. It was coaches. It was boosters. It was trustees. All these different people never really got a chance to know the full Gus. And when that happens, they're not as willing to give you the benefit of the doubt. And I think, as I've said throughout this show, he never had a lot of goodwill bought in with important people. And so the moment they got a chance to knock him out, they did. And that's because they didn't have a relationship with him.
Yeah, I'll throw one more thing in about Gus, though. So this is not the last that we've seen of Gus by any means, and it wouldn't even be a surprise whatsoever if Gus is not only back in college football next season, but maybe even in the SEC. So one of the for people in the coaching world to throw out there is that if Tennessee does open up, which I don't know if it's 100% at this point, that Pruitt's going to be back. Obviously, that's something that's been up in the air recently in terms of his status. If Tennessee did ultimately make a move, something that's come up from a few different people at this point is to keep an eye on Gus as a possibility for that Tennessee job, that they think he, at the very least, could get a look there.
We're gonna
make a move.
We're gonna touch on that at the end of the show in a little bit more detail. But before we do, let's talk about the college football playoffs happening this week, particularly the one that we all cover here from the state of Alabama, the Rose Bowl. Technically, I guess it's the Rose Bowl. It's being played in Dallas between Alabama and Notre Dame. This is a game that a lot of people are already the narrative is about Notre Dame getting crushed and how often that happens. You're not going to hear that kind of talk from Nick Saban, certainly. But, Matt, you have a story up on AL.com today talking to some coaches that have coached against Notre Dame this season and actually have experience having to prepare for them and playing against them, and kind of getting their thoughts on this game and how Notre Dame matches up. What were you able to glean from those conversations?
That there's a reason that Notre Dame's a 3-touchdown underdog, pretty much. Notre Dame's obviously had a great year. It was undefeated going into the ACC title game, but there are some deficiencies there on that roster that, even though they have some very good players, including the Butkus Award winner at linebacker, it's going to be tough for them not only to win this game, but potentially even keeping it close. So two of the biggest deficiencies that came up consistently, the cornerback group for them, which doesn't help when you're going into a game against a receiver group for Alabama led by the Litnikoff Award winner and potential Heisman winner in Devontae Smith, and obviously a quarterback in Mac Jones, who's a Heisman finalist also. And then to go along with that, you have a receiver group that has put up some okay numbers. I think they have a guy who's right around 700 receiving yards, but big physical guys who don't necessarily scare secondary coaches and defensive coordinators because they don't have the speed, explosive element that obviously some of these other groups around the country have. Has some very good tight ends, one of the best tight end groups in the country, but the receiver group is one that has come up consistently as another deficiency, weak area, vulnerable area to go along with that cornerback group.
Kind of an interesting contrast, Matt, because the last game that you did a story like this for, we kind of heard a little bit of the opposite in terms of strengths versus weaknesses. It was all about Florida's incredible receiver talent, and on the other side of the ball, not a great rushing defense. And what did we see in the game? Florida torches Alabama's defense down the field in the passing game, and then Najee Harris goes absolutely crazy running the ball. So this game feels like a little bit the other way around, where Notre Dame is probably not going to be able to take advantage of Alabama's biggest weakness defensively. But they are, according to the stuff that you heard from coaches, they're a lot better up front defensively.
Yeah. So one thing that's worth adding in, so I bring up the weaknesses, the vulnerable areas for them. They do have an experienced guy, a quarterback who hasn't lit the world on fire from a number standpoint this year, but has done a great job protecting the football. So a dual threat type guy who, it's funny because people don't really talk about him being a runner or talk about his dual threat capabilities, but he's run for like 500 yards, 8 touchdowns this year, and is definitely capable of making some things happen outside the pocket, not only as a scrambler, but just creating time, even in terms of throwing the ball and giving him some additional time to find people downfield. To go along with that, I mentioned the tight end group. That's a definite strength, and Alabama's obviously had issues at different points this year, including in the SEC title game, facing off against tight ends and slowing some of those top-tier guys down. Running back group, solid. Offensive line, one of the best in college football. And then lastly, from a defensive standpoint, they're definitely better in the front seven than what they are in the secondary, and specifically with that cornerback group. The feedback was definitely good on them from a front seven standpoint. And it's worth noting also that while they had some trouble against Clemson, not only stopping them from throwing the ball, but also stopping their running game, while that was the case in that game, for the most part this year, have done a great job limiting opposing running backs and opposing running games, including even the first Clemson game where Travis Etienne, who's one of the best running backs in the country, only had 28 yards on 18 carries in that first game against Notre Dame.
John, we've gotten a chance to hear from the Alabama assistant coaches, which is always a very rare treat and something we only really get when Alabama makes the playoffs, essentially. But Steve Sarkisian just won the Broyles Award. He's obviously having a phenomenal year as an offensive play caller. On the other side, we've heard Pete Golding, who we saw getting chewed out on national television last week against Florida, kind of came out and did what a lot of Saban coordinators do, which is—
you mean Coach Saban?
Oh yes, I'm sorry. We don't call him Nick. We don't call him Saban. It's Coach to you. But anyways, the brush off that you get from Saban assistants when you ask them about that topic, about getting yelled at on the sidelines, is pretty consistent. And that's what Pete Golding did yesterday. Basically said, look, it happens, man. I didn't do a good enough job, so that's what I'm going to hear from my boss when it happens. If you're Notre Dame right now, I guess, and you're watching this Alabama team, what is kind of your best hope to attack them? What do you see as Alabama's potential stumbling blocks, I guess, going forward?
I mean, it's extremely hard for me to even talk myself into Notre Dame winning this game. If they were playing Ohio State or Clemson, and I think they'll play one or the other in the national championship game, assuming they win on Friday. I think you could find things that either Ohio State does or Clemson does, but I just don't see it in Notre Dame. I think we've seen when these teams have matched up in the past, Alabama's blown them out. I just don't think they do enough of the things, kind of like Matt was getting into earlier, enough of the things that Alabama does struggle against a little bit. I mean, maybe their tight end just has a massive game and they just can't find a way to stop him. I mean, maybe that helps. But I just think Alabama is too strong from top to bottom to lose this game. I just don't see, feel free to old takes expose me after this game. But I mean, I just think it's a lock. I just don't see any way that Alabama loses this game. I just don't see it.
Well, we will certainly be.
They're going to lose by 35 now, courtesy of John Paul.
Yeah, fans can blame me for the jinx if it happens, but this is just, again, I think this is just such a talented team from top to bottom. The offense, I mean, again, they have 3 of the top 5 Heisman finalists on offense.
It's unreal.
the defense has multiple probably first-round picks. I mean, Patrick Surtain could be a top 10 pick on defense. I mean, they're just loaded. And, Notre Dame just doesn't have the same level of talent. I think Notre Dame is a very good team. They've been one of the best teams all year. But when you look from top to bottom, they don't have a similar level of talent. And that's why, people have expected it to pretty much be Alabama, Clemson, part, 5 now at this point? Again, just because they've been the top 2 teams really all year, even though Clemson lost that one game without Trevor Lawrence.
But 2 matchups that are worth keeping an eye on. So Notre Dame's offensive line, which once again is one of the best in college football, and I think a Joe Moore Award finalist, against that Alabama front seven that at different points this year has looked maybe not like typical Alabama front seven. And then to go along with that, don't forget that Landon Dickerson's out for Alabama at center. It's probably a good thing when center doesn't get talked about consistently throughout the course of the game, and we'll see if the center that's replacing him, Chris Owens, ends up getting spotlighted or talked about more during the course of that matchup. That is a significant loss, especially when you're facing a Notre Dame front seven that definitely is talented and has been a strength for them throughout the course of the season. So that's something at least worth keeping an eye on, that center position for Alabama, to go along with, once again, Notre Dame's offensive line against Alabama in the front seven.
Well, one area of unquestioned strength for Alabama all year has been wide receiver. While we've been talking, Devontae Smith was just named the AP Player of the Year, which is also a key Heisman predictor, in addition to being a prestigious award in its own right. So very interesting announcement there. We've got a question from our audience about the receiver position, by the way, from James Turner here, who asks if there is a chance Jalen Waddle might play. And we actually heard this directly addressed from Nick Saban, but I'll ask you, Matt, both from this week, what Saban said, and then maybe what you think potentially going forward about Jalen Waddle.
And the biggest feedback I've gotten on him during the course of the last couple of days is similar to what Nick Saban said. He's not back practicing yet. So that's been essentially the response I've gotten without the people I've checked with getting into specifics as far as the likelihood of him being able to play in a game, if there is one, after the Notre Dame one. Just that, once again, he is not back practicing at this point. Rehab's going well. They're optimistic just from an outlook standpoint with him and recovery and all of that. But at this point, is not back to practicing for.
We're essentially full 14 days out from the national championship game. Is that right? More than that, even potentially. I don't know when anything is anymore.
You guys are better at math than I am.
Yeah, I mean there is a non-insignificant amount of time between now and the national championship game. So even though it sounds like, from what Matt and what Nick Saban said this week, that Jalen is not going to be a part of things in the Rose Bowl, there's still a fairly significant amount of time between now and the national championship game. So it's worth checking in on again. Come back and ask us the question before the national championship game. We'll see if anything's changed. Let's wrap.
Directing that at me, that's worth checking in on. From
you should definitely check on it too, yeah. Matt. But
I think
our commenters should also check with us about it again. So before we wrap up today, I've got one more question, and we'll do a lot of spinning forward once the season is over. We'll do a lot of looking at 2021 as we continue this show into the off season. And by the way, I haven't mentioned it yet, but if you are looking to keep up with our show somewhere other than on Facebook or YouTube, you can subscribe to us as a podcast on iTunes or on Spotify. Or I guess I should say the Apple Podcast app. I don't think we call it iTunes anymore, Grandpa. But if you just want to hear us in audio form only, you can get it in either of those two places, or at AL.com. We post the podcast feed as well.
And it's worth throwing out also the first 25 subscribers. I don't know if you finalized this or not, Matt, but the first 25 subscribers get not only 5, not only 10 free lunches from El Barrio, courtesy of Matt Scalisi, but get the first 25 subscribers get 25 lunches courtesy of Matt Scalisi.
None of this is true. This is lies. Let's cut him off, Patrick, producer. We're cutting him off. We don't allow lies on this program. Okay. Yeah. You can bring him back. Okay, so let's wrap this up. Anyways, we'll do a lot more looking ahead into the future in the weeks to come. But today, I wanted to talk a little bit about the SEC job market, since it seems to have settled down at this point. I don't think we're going to see any more changes at this point in this year's cycle. You never know, but it doesn't look like it's going to go that way. Looking ahead to next year, to either of you, is there a job that you've got your eye on the most as potentially coming open and being a part of the coaching carousel in 2021? And I'll start with John Talty here.
Yeah, I think the most obvious one at this point, and Zenit's hit on it earlier, is just going to be Tennessee. There's been a lot of rumors already. It looks like, I think, as I've said recently, the more the time goes on, the more likely it looks like Jeremy Pruitt will be back next year. But he enters into next season, I think, on probably the hottest seed, certainly in the SEC and maybe in the entire country. And so he's someone that I think you have to really keep an eye on as to whether he's going to be able to survive. And, like Matt said, I've also heard some of the early, Gus would be interesting at Tennessee talk. And the other kind of big name that has been out there is, of course, Hugh Freeze at Liberty, who I believe there would be mutual interest between Tennessee and Hugh Freeze. He is someone that there's always going to be baggage there. It's always going to be a sell by any school that wants to hire him to the SEC as to why. But he is a name, I think, to watch at Tennessee.
Matt, any jobs that you've got your eye on next year? Not for you personally, but for coming open in the SEC.
Zenitz would also like to throw his name in for this.
That's right. He's a strength and conditioning candidate for sure.
Hey, the Tennessee head coach or Tennessee strength and conditioning coach probably makes a lot more than what I'm making right now. So if Homer wants to give me a call, hey, I'm all ears. Happy to pass along my number. But in terms of other jobs, I'll throw out two just that I have my eye on, not even just specifically for next year, but just moving forward. So one would be LSU to go along with Tennessee. So obviously some behind the scenes things going on there. We'll see where all of that goes. But I will say in terms of LSU, based on what they're going to be having back from a talent perspective, I do think they're going to be in position to have improvement compared to just what would happen this year, and obviously the record that they finished with. Close the year with a couple good wins, and some good momentum coming out of this season for them, and have enough coming back that I could see some improvement for them next year. And then the other one that I'd be keeping an eye on moving forward, it's a high-profile one that's outside of the SEC, just in Texas. So I know the AD with Texas has come out and indicated that I guess Tom Herman will be back. I don't know if people in the coaching world necessarily view that as much of a foregone conclusion, and that'll be interesting just to continue to monitor moving forward, because if they did move on from Tom Herman, there are some guys who I think could potentially be in the mix for that people in the SEC would be very much aware of. But that'll be another interesting one to follow.
Absolutely. Always interesting when Texas gets involved. As anybody who has covered Alabama for more than a few years can tell you, it will immediately throw a lot of headlines your way, many of which are completely ridiculous and baseless. But Texas is sort of just a floating force of chaos whenever that job comes open. So I think it would be interesting, certainly, and would make the conversation very dicey in a lot of programs around the country.
To your point, Scalisi, I think there are a lot of similarities between Texas and Auburn. There's a lot of just kind of people behind the scenes.
Absolutely.
Moves. And so, Zenitz and I just lived through the Auburn coaching experience. I think we're all, a little burnt out by it. So, if Texas opens up sometime in the next year or so, thoughts and prayers to the Texas beat writers.
Absolutely.
It's going to be a journey.
Yeah, definitely thoughts and prayers to the servers for real estate websites in Austin as well. Always get a workout whenever there's an open job there. So, all right, guys. Well, that's it for us this week. We're going to have tons of coverage for you throughout the week as we get ready for the Rose Bowl and the Citrus Bowl for Alabama and Auburn. We're going to have coverage all day on New Year's Day on Friday of both games, in particular pregame and postgame shows that you can get live here wherever you're watching this right now. So Join us then. Have a great New Year's. And guys, we will be back next week to talk about whatever it is that happens.
And more feedback on Wonder Woman 84 and Jingle Jazz.
Andrews Sports Medicine, aggressively pursuing victory over injury. Call 205-939-3699.